This benchmark took a while to complete. We first started benchmarking CPUs in Battlefield 1 just after the GPU content was completed for that game. And following that, I had to follow up with AMD to look into some of their test methodology so we could validate it on our end with CPUs. But the CPU benchmark is finally complete. We tested the i7 down to the i3 and the X4 845, 8370, 8320 and more. Before getting to the results, this content is brought to you by Antec and the new Cube Mini ITX case, which positions the GPU faceplate so that it's visible through the top of the case. Learn more in the link below. We've posted 2 content pieces for Battlefield 1 already. The first was a benchmark of video card performance in the game using an i7, as we normally do, because we're isolating the video card as a variable. And the second was a look at HBAO versus SSAO technologies in the game and their impact on performance, which was for the most part negligible. Today, we are looking at the CPU performance explicitly, and CPU benchmarking is a little bit unique. It's not quite as straightforward as GPU benchmarking because isolation of the CPU as a bottleneck is sometimes more difficult to do, and extrapolating the scaling between one CPU and the next is also not necessarily easy. So we've defined all of that, as always, in the article linked in the description below, but I'll go through some of it here just for a quick recap. Tests were conducted using ultra settings at 1080p with 2 GPUs. One was a GTX 1080 FTW hybrid used to place emphasis on the CPU performance. Interestingly, the 1080 is powerful enough that just running a lower resolution is enough to demonstrate CPU scaling, and we can leave the graphics options more realistically high. This is new with this generation of GPUs. The next test was an RX 480 8GB Gaming X, which gives more of a middle-of-the-road look at things, and we'll get to that later. The point of running a lower resolution is to show scaling performance, and as you increase the resolution, load will be placed more heavily on the pixel pipeline and the GPU's ability to draw and sample all of those pixels, which of course shifts the load. DirectX 12 performance was measured using the onPresent variable from PresentMon. We extract 1% and 0.1% low metrics using a Python script that gamersnexus created. Game graphics are configured to ultra, 96-degree horizontal FOV, GPU memory restriction off, and VSync, of course, off. And the test methodology in the article probably answer all of your other questions, including drivers used, why we test a particular way we did, and what the realistic hardware impact is. We've also got our benchmark courses there. Our article also has some raw data from test runs in combat scenarios versus non-combat, which gives a better idea as to scaling. And this is important as multiplayer is effectively impossible to reasonably benchmark between this many devices. So our scaling tests in the article should answer those multiplayer performance questions. We're starting with DirectX 11. DirectX 12 will come next. The i7 5930K at stock frequencies hits a frame rate of about 158 FPS average, with lows well above 100 FPS. The 6700K with hyper-threading enabled, that's the HT1 in the benchmark chart, is next in line at 155 FPS average, with 1% lows of 111 and 0.1% lows of 96. There's not a huge gap here, and a good amount of that is because of the 6700K's increased clock frequency over the 5930K, which you'll see in a moment is actually a pretty big impactor on performance between CPUs. Interestingly, disabling hyperthreading results in a reduction in FPS average of about 4%, down to nearly 149, but our lows take the biggest hit. They're now 95 and 80 FPS. This isn't significant in terms of visible frame rate. You'll still experience the game more or less the same way, but hyperthreading is clearly beneficial to low values in this test scenario. Moving down the line, the more mainstream i5 6600K at stock speeds is achieving a 140 FPS average, landing at about 15 FPS behind the hyperthreaded 6700K. This is where we see CPUs beginning to limit the GTX 1080 FTW hybrid we selected, and that's intentionally used to demonstrate exactly this type of performance scaling. The 6600K's performance trails the 6700K with hyperthreading by about 10%. Moving further down the list, the i5 6400 non-K CPU at 2.7 GHz, a good deal slower, is starting to show a frequency advantage to the 6600K with a performance disparity of nearly 20 FPS between the 66 and 6400 i5 CPUs. Finally, we're met with the i3 6300 at 111 FPS average, now a full 44 FPS behind the flagship Skylake CPU, and then the FX-8370 at 90 FPS average. And average FPS is fairly tightly timed on most of these devices, but that has a lot to do with, one, the API in Battlefield 1, DirectX 11 tends to do well here, and two, the GPU itself, which is responsible for a lot of the frame times. But still, the FX-8370 does well to keep its low frame rates within reasonable range of its average, despite a lower average overall. The FX-8370 is about 65 FPS behind the 6700K, trailed next by the power-saving 8320E, that's what the E means in its suffix, it's a lower power chip, and that's at 77 FPS average. The A10 7870K follows this, but note that the 7870K is effectively identical to the Athlon X4 880K, so if that CPU interests you, or is the one you have, you could compare it pretty directly to the 7870K, and the 880K may even perform marginally better because it's got a 100 MHz increase in clock rate. Next, the Athlon X4 845 runs at 63 FPS average, just a few frames behind where the 880K would be, although there's a clear choke point in these CPUs when running on a high-end GPU. One useful thing we can learn is that the X4 845 would perform close enough to the 880K that the price difference could be enough to encourage 845 pickups over the 880K. In this case, though, there's some overclocking differences as well. Let's look at the scaling of all these devices in percentage form for a moment. This chart shows devices with the i5-6600K as a baseline of 100% performance. And the important part to note, as stated, we're using a 1080 FTW explicitly to draw out the limits of the CPUs and see where each chokes as we go further down the stack. You'll want to make sure your CPU choice does not limit the GPU choice at least too much. It's always possible. But note that also the higher end devices used with higher resolutions, as expected, would put more load on the GPU. So if we ran this 1080 at 1440, the story might be a little bit different. Many of the differences between the i5 and the i7 devices vanish when moving to 1440p or 4K on the GTX 1080, and that's because we're now shoving more pixels into the pipe for the GPU. Let's look at DirectX 12. Dx12 destroys frame time performance at the 1% low and 0.1% low spectrum and posts negative scaling when moving between APIs with Intel. We see a negative hit of approximately 25 FPS on the i7-6700K and on the i5-6600K. The FX-8370 increases its average by 1 to 2 FPS, but like all the other devices, GPUs included, posts worse low frame performance. The FX-8320E also posts an improvement of about 2 to 3 FPS average on the FX architecture, and the 7870K, nearly an 880K equivalent, with the X4 845 both see slight negative scaling of about 1 to 3 FPS, but these chips are a different architecture and they run fewer cores. So we're confident in these results, but we're curious about them. After looking through some of AMD's own public blog posts about their performance, we decided to reach out to AMD and ask how they tested Battlefield 1. And after a few days of back and forth emailing with one another, we talked to several people from their test team and engineering team in the test lab, and validating each other's tests and methodology and things like that. We decided to run more tests, this time with a lower end GPU, and AMD said they were seeing upwards of 28.5% gains with an FX-6350 and an RX 480. So they said that they used a 3-minute long test, which is a bit longer than what we do, and they played on a different map completely. They played on through Mud and Blood, which is one of the British levels. And other than this, their settings were pretty similar to ours in terms of quality. We decided to adopt their methodology and use that for further validation. And given the information that we had, I think we have a pretty good example of the way AMD ran their test, but I still don't know everything about their setup. I don't know exactly what RAM they used, what speed it was. I don't know if they're using on-present, and there's a couple other things we don't know as well, but we've got a good amount of it. So it'd be odd, but it is possible that running the game for a longer period, like their 3-minute test run, would be enough to begin hitting some sort of draw call or other threshold that you might encounter with a poorly optimized game and might not encounter with a shorter test. Given Battlefield 1's already questionable optimization, this did seem worth testing. A few more things to note here. AMD ran 4 test passes per setting per device, and then they averaged all 4 of those results. In GN's methodology, we run 6 to 8 test passes, and we always throw the first 2 sets of data away. This is because the game outputs horrifically varied performance when first launched, and we see drastically reduced performance while still loading everything into memory. Some examples of a single device going through multiple test passes are on the screen now. You can actually see how it scales and sort of levels and equalizes as you run through a couple of the test passes. And we believe our test is representative of what happens in a multiplayer map, and I've tested that too. After you've spawned and run around for a minute or two, performance improves greatly with Dx11 across the board and in Dx12's 0.1% low frame time performance. That first run, though, will look like garbage compared to the rest, and so we do what you do with garbage. We get rid of it. This is even visible when the level is loading. You can see prefab elements at various LODs attempting to pop in, especially environment elements like foliage and grass. Now, another final important point to note, AMD did not provide us with frame time metrics and only offered us average frame rates, and we've already shown, as a few other outlets have, that Battlefield 1's DirectX 12 performance can actually be worse in terms of frame times than Dx11. And as a result, it can stutter through gameplay. So, the RX 480. These tests were conducted on the Through Mud and Blood campaign level and were tested using a much different methodology. We ran 3 tests for 3 minutes each with highly consistent frame rate output because we'd practiced the test run and could accurately repeat it each time. So it's pretty accurate despite being 3 minutes long. These tests were run after receiving input from AMD on their own internal testing of the game. With an RX 480 and an FX-8370, we're still seeing no meaningful scaling. Technically, in this testing, the Dx12 results are about 4% better than the Dx11 results, but that's still 4%, and the negative hit to frame times is definitely not worth it. Even with these altered test methods, we're not seeing the performance swings that AMD reported and told us, and we're definitely not seeing favorable frame time performance in Dx12, though AMD did not make any comments about frame times. Now, this doesn't mean that AMD's wrong. It also doesn't mean that we're wrong, and really it just comes down to a few things. There's differences in testing that we may not know about, different variables potentially measured for performance or different means of measuring those variables. And AMD also did use an FX-8350, which, although it should not scale a difference of 4% to 30% when looking at something like an 8370, it could certainly scale a little bit differently. So we don't have one of those and obviously didn't test it. So GN spent about a full week validating these results. It's more time than we spent on any of these benchmarks really in terms of validating existing results that we're confident in. So now we're definitely fully confident in the testing, having retested it 1,000 different ways on many different devices, and we're confident that the performance difference between Dx11 and Dx12 remains largely the same. For multiplayer use especially, we're seeing no scaling performance that is noteworthy on Dx12, regardless of whose GPU or CPU we use, and this fits our previous testing, which validated extensively the GPU performance with both DirectX 12 and DirectX 11 and saw similar scaling, that is to say effectively 0, and negative scaling when looking at frame times. Battlefield 1's DirectX 12 performance remains spotty and suboptimal regardless of whose CPU is used, or even GPU for some extent anyway, but definitely on the CPUs, and overall we're seeing poor 1% and 0.1% low frame rate metrics, and that's across the board, even when conducting extended benchmarking, 3 minutes, 3 passes of that, which is a lot longer versus the regular 30-second but 8-pass test runs. And we've defined all of that and why each one works and works well in the methodology section below. But the point is that with both sets of methodologies, ours and AMD's, we're still seeing poor frame rate scaling at the low end. The frame times kind of stretch out and have a larger latency between them on occasion, and that is reflected in those pretty spotty 1% and 0.1% low metrics, again, regardless of device. The stack remains mostly the same in terms of hierarchy. The high-end i7 and i5 K-SKU devices do perform significantly better with DirectX 11. The i7 6700K posts a definitive performance gain over the i5 6600K in Dx11 at about 10 to 11% in averages, and the 6600K runs about 15% faster than the i5 6400 non-K CPU, largely a result of the faster frequency on the 6600K. FX series CPUs and the i3-6300 CPU are struggling in terms of performance and scaling overall when looking at the other devices, and the disparity between the FX CPUs and the i3-6300 could be related to the increased memory speed support of the i3, which is what we're researching next, so stay tuned and subscribe for that. Then the X4 845 and X4 880K surrogate post performance that is pretty limited and dragging the GTX 1080 down with them to around 60 to 65 FPS average, but would still be perfectly playable on BF1 if reducing settings and running an equally low-end GPU like an RX 460, GTX 1050, 1050 Ti, or similar. Of course, depending on your GPU, CPU selection could be less relevant. If you're running something like a GTX 1060 or an RX 480, the 10% difference between an i5 6600K and an i7 6700K could become largely irrelevant in the face of that lower end GPU. That's what you'd expect. The GPU starts becoming more of a choke point than the CPU, depending on your graphics quality settings. And next, we're looking at memory. So that's my next point of interest for Battlefield 1. I do suspect that memory has a bit more of an impact in BF1 than what we might normally expect in other titles. So we'll be testing that. Not 100% sure yet, that's why it has to be tested. But do subscribe for that content. As always, comment if you have thoughts on this testing. And the Patreon link is in the post-roll video if you want to help us out directly. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.